We're pleased to have David Daley here. I've looked up your resume and it's pretty impressive. You're a senior fellow with Fair Vote, as I understand it. Mr. Daley has written 2 books. I don't know how you introduced the first one, but I'm going to call it Rat Effed for the sake of being PG-13, which is about gerrymandering and manipulation of maps and kind of some applications throughout the country. And then he's got a more recent book called Unrigged, which I've listened to on Audible, and I've double listened to 2 of the chapters. I'm hoping that he'll tell us a little bit more about. It's a really good book for grassroots type of motivation for people. So if you'd be inclined to get it on Audible or buy it, I think it'd be a good purchase to help us all do a better job at what we do. Mr. Daley's also been an editor at Salon. He's had articles published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and the list goes on and on. And are you still associated with the University of Georgia? I saw that you were had some sort of okay, all right, and I've seen you all over network TV too. I've seen you on MSNBC and some of the networks and things like that when Rat Effed came out. So with that, instead of just turning it over to you, I guess I'd ask you the question. Right now, we had some preliminary discussions about what's going on here in Nebraska. Would you have any advice or any guidance as to how we could help influence the map drawing process that Nebraska is going through right now?
Sure. Thank you, Wes. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight and being part of this. And I appreciate all that you're doing to try to win ranked choice voting out in Nebraska. I think everything Larry said is exactly right on with regards to its advantages and the kind of difference it could make in our politics. It's just this really polarized and I think frightful moment. And so we are in the midst of redistricting. Here we go. When the census data was officially released to states about 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was go time. It was the firing gun for states to begin this process of drawing political maps that will affect every single one of us and every aspect of our democracy at the state and congressional level for the next 10 years. And what it sounds like is happening in Nebraska is not that much different from what's happening in the rest of the country. Politicians like to keep these maps under their tight control. These maps are central to their control. Being able to choose their own voters, to draw their own districts, is how they are able to maintain power and stay in office. And the maps are so important to them that they want the public to believe that this process is complicated and messy and boring and all about math. So they try to do as much of it as they can behind closed doors. Then they try to already have the maps finished, to rush them out into the public process, and then say, here they are. Maybe you can take a quick look, but you don't actually have time to really do a full analysis of what these maps mean. And then they are enacted and passed into law super quickly, and before anybody really has the ability to make any serious public comment or study them. So what you have to try to do is drag this process out into the sunlight. Processes that Republicans try to keep in back rooms, they want them there for a reason. They are trying to get away with something in private that they know they cannot get away with in public. And what is so important is to let them know that you are watching, that you care about this process. They can get away with it when they think people aren't watching or don't care or think it's dull or not central to the way that our government works. And we have to show them otherwise. And that means being there at public hearings. It means calling their offices and demanding openness and transparency in public hearings and fair comment and time in between the public reveal of the maps and ability to comment on them again. There is redistricting software that is available to the public for the very first time this year, this election cycle. Things like Plan Score that comes from the Campaign Legal Center, or what the Princeton Gerrymandering Project is working on, or Dave's redistricting software. Nothing to do with me, I promise. It's some other Dave in the redistricting world. There are too many of us. And you can use this software to draw your own maps and to show your communities of interest, but you can also use this software to show the impact of the lines that these politicians have drawn. You can use the same technology that they use to drive us apart to see through what they are doing and highlight that. And if activists and the media use this moment and use this technology and software in the right way, we can have more influence and impact over this process, this cycle, than we've ever had before.
I was looking over some things to engage in this conversation with you. And one of the things I've seen from looking at discussion of your book is that redistricting creates more partisanship. It drives us more to the extremes. Can you describe how that feeds that beast?
Yeah, I think it does. And, I don't think you have to look very far to see this. Just over the course of the last few days, you've been able to watch this. It's a congressman from North Carolina. You may know his name, Madison Cawthorn. And he gave a talk to a group in North Carolina over the weekend. And he said, we all need to be storing up some ammunition. And he added that we all know it was a stolen election. And he said, if our election systems continue to be rigged and continue to be stolen, then it's going to lead to one place: bloodshed. As much as I am willing to defend our liberty at all costs, there's nothing I would dread more than having to pick up arms against a fellow American. Not sure you posit that if you really dread the idea. And what I would say is that we awaken every day, right, to a democracy that feels like its key institutions are many ways have been shattered, and that there are new assaults on our foundational freedoms. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for why we're in this moment. Our constitutional system is really not made for the kind of two-party polarization that we have right now. We have these winner-takes-all districts that break toward extremes under this polarization. I think Democrats have neglected state and local elections at a time when Republicans understood the importance of these races and really invested in an effort to win them. But there's a really simpler reason to how Madison Cawthorn can spew this kind of abhorrent insurrectionist talk, this incitement to violence. His district exists because of partisan gerrymandering. Without partisan gerrymandering, he's just another guy on Twitter talking tough, right? With gerrymandering, he's a member of one of the most exclusive clubs in the world. He's one of 435 members of Congress. And Cawthorn's road to power begins in 2010 as part of that effort that we talk about and that I write about in RADEFT, for Republicans really understanding that their path back to power after the big Democrat win in 2008 with Barack Obama would be through redistricting in 2010. That provided an opportunity for them to win back the U.S. House and state legislatures around the country, because all these lines would be drawn if they could win enough key races in enough key places. And so they invest $30 million in this plan called the Red Map, the Redistricting a Majority Project. And they do indeed win back both chambers in North Carolina, in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Alabama, lots of states. And in North Carolina, they set out to draw, in this purple state, an unrepresentative 10-3 map, 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats from what's essentially, a 7-6 state, probably. And the way they had to do this was by taking the city of Asheville, which is out in the western mountains of North Carolina, if you've ever been there. It's the biggest city in the western part of the state, but it's surrounded by all of these conservative rural mountain towns. So it's probably a lot like parts of Nebraska, where a city is surrounded by, bigger rural areas. And that oftentimes creates a swing district, right? It creates a place where people have to go out and talk to folks in the city and in the rural areas and really have conversations and persuade them. And that was the case in North Carolina 11 for a long time. Throughout the 2000s, that seat goes back and forth. It's a Republican seat after 9/11, and as George Bush rallies the country into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and then it goes blue in 2006 as the nation soured on that war. 2008 as the economy turned. When they redrew the lines after 2010, that conservative Democrat who represented the seat took one look and he said, "I can't win here," and he retired. Immediately, a man who had been a local businessman jumps into this race. He had had a career in meteorology. He'd run a sandwich shop. He'd been a local real estate guy. His name was Mark Meadows. And Mark Meadows wins this race by out-birthering the field. And what he does is he recognizes that because of the way the district line had been drawn, they put a line through the middle of Asheville. They cut Asheville in half, put half those Democrats in one of these rural districts, half in the other. It's like you did the same thing in Omaha, right? You would probably have 2 red districts instead of 1 purple one. And Meadows recognized that the only race that mattered now was the Republican primary. And so he's at a Tea Party rally that summer, and somebody asks him if he would do an investigation into Barack Obama's citizenship. And the guy before him, who had been the other frontrunner, said, "Yeah, I'm just not so sure." He kind of dissembles. And Meadows says, "Yes, I will send him back to Kenya or wherever it is he comes from." And in that moment, in this district, Mark Meadows is on his way to real political power. It's Meadows who goes to Washington and files the parliamentary motion that takes down John Boehner as Speaker of the House. It's Meadows who forces the October 2013 shutdown over Obamacare funding. After that shutdown, the New Yorker went and ran the numbers on the districts that Meadows and his fellow members of what was being called the Suicide Caucus represented. And what they found was that those districts, even as the country was becoming more multiracial, more diverse, that those districts were becoming dramatically more white, dramatically older, dramatically more rural, dramatically more conservative. Redistricting had turned back the clock and created a different America than the one that actually existed. So Meadows becomes Donald Trump's chief of staff. That seat is now held by Madison Cawthorn. This is what redistricting and extreme gerrymandering does to our politics. It changes the kind of people who run. It changes the kinds of people who get elected. And then it changes the way that they behave when they get to Washington. They're not incentivized to talk to each other. They're not incentivized to compromise, because any of this just gets you a primary challenge from someone further to your left, further to your right. And that's all that matters in an uncompetitive district. You've turned the incentives of our system on its head. And so does polarization comes first? Does gerrymandering come first? I'd say they all act as an accelerant on each other, but they've all acted as an accelerant that has exploded onto our politics, I think, in deeply harmful and serious ways.
One of our members asked the question, do you think if we overturned the law, the 1929 law that sets the number of representatives in the House from 435, and if I can turn that into a compound question, I'm also curious about maybe your views on proportional representation kind of at large. And then I see in your Rat-Eft book, there's some discussion about the fact that our system, as far as the way we draw districts, et cetera, it must be somewhat unique as opposed to other democratic systems. I don't know if you could address maybe all three of those kind of as one. And I know that would be something that'd be further down the road, but is that something that we should pursue?
Unique is a nice way of putting it. I mean, we are really the only modern democracy in the world that allows our politicians to draw their own districts and choose their own voters. We imagined a system in which these folks would have to face the voters every 2 years. And instead, we've created one in which they can draw themselves a safe seat for 10 years and then come back and draw it again and make it even safer. Every other democracy in the world really has gotten an advantage on us in this regard. Yes, I think what we very much need to do is head down the road of something more proportional. And I say that because, I mean, I talked to you tonight from Massachusetts, liberal, crazy blue Massachusetts, which has not elected a Republican to Congress since 1994. But there's plenty of Republicans here. They win statewide. We've got a Republican governor who's one of the most popular in the country. In fact, Massachusetts has actually had one Republican governor since the days of Michael Dukakis. So that goes back a ways. But you can't draw a district here. It's almost impossible to draw a district that would elect a Republican. It almost can't be done. So if you were, however, to use larger multi-member districts and use ranked choice voting to elect members through a proportional system, you would probably get 6 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 1 independent, and you would get a completely different and more representative mix going off to Congress. And then those folks would be incentivized to behave differently once they get there. And I think that would just make all the difference in the world. Don Byer's got a bill in front of this Congress called the Fair Representation Act. And I really think that that's the gold standard for how we fix redistricting. Our problem with redistricting in many ways is a problem with districting itself. It's the idea of single member winner take all that makes these lines so important. And if you had larger districts, the individual lines simply don't matter as much. It's not possible to kind of draw them through a city like Asheville or like Austin, Texas, or so many others and divide them. You would take the power away from those lines. And I think you would end up with a Congress that was elected much differently and functioned much differently.
Okay, so I would encourage anyone, if you have any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try to read those or get some of those answered. But this might be a good time to shift into what's unrigged. And I don't know exactly how to ask the question there, but we're a grassroots group trying to work with ranked choice voting. We can kind of see that we're not going to necessarily do it through legislative action, that we'll probably have to do a ballot initiative. There's a young lady on here, Erica, who does a podcast with me. And we've had the opportunity to interview a gentleman from Alaska. And, they got open primaries and ranked choice. But as we talked to him, we've also talked to people from Massachusetts where they were trying to do ranked choice and were unsuccessful. And we've talked to some people from New York. And I guess what I've learned is I think there's a little bit different dynamic in every state. When we were talking to Alaska, it sounds like, I swear it seemed like 70 or 80% of them just consider themselves so independent, they weren't going to let anybody tell them what to do. And in Nebraska, we've got 40% Republican, probably mid to upper 20s are Democratic, and the rest are independents. So if you add the independents with the Democrats, actually it's like 51%, but the Republicans have control of most things. So I guess my question to you is, if you want to address that, tie this into your main chapter in Unrigged, and maybe even tie it into the I forget what the chapter is called about Medicaid with the green bus or the green van. I can't remember what it is, and maybe you can tell them how you slept the night in it too, or whatever you want to share. So anyway, if maybe you'd want to start down that road, that might be interesting for us as a grassroots organization of how we can do some things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had written Red F, which is really a book about toxic extreme partisan gerrymandering and how it, combined with voter suppression laws passed by these newly unaccountable legislatures, had really tied our democracy into these profoundly depressing double knots of unfairness and established in many ways a nearly unbeatable minority rule in otherwise competitive states. And it was a depressing book, and it wasn't easy to see a solution to this anti-democratic crisis that contributed so dramatically to the extremism and the hopelessness that plague our politics. I would go out and give talks like this, and sometimes I'd feel like I was sucking the oxygen out of the room, and I needed a way to bring the story around and try to offer a little bit of hope. And that's really where Unrigged began, with that quest for hope. And I found it in unusual and really unexpected places. I found it, as Wes said, driving across rural Idaho on that rickety green RV with these young activists who were determined to expand Medicaid in a red state. Found it on Native American land in Utah and North Dakota, where tribes mounted heroic pushes to defend their right to vote against brutishly targeted voter ID bills and decades of gerrymandering. Found it door knocking in Florida with activists fighting to end a nasty vestige of Jim Crow and restore voting rights to 1.4 million citizens who had completed their sentences. Across Michigan with volunteers working and pushing back against one of the worst partisan gerrymanders in the country, taking on a fight against all kinds of billionaire dark money and the Chamber of Commerce that nobody thought they could win. Found it registering voters at the bus station in Birmingham, Alabama, in courtrooms with these genius mathematicians and the high school history teacher back from Iraq who convinced a panel of judges to declare the state's congressional map unconstitutional as a partisan gerrymander. Found it in Maine with these amazing citizens who went door to door, not once, not twice, but 3 times to win ranked choice voting in statewide elections. And what I think is so amazing about these stories is that these citizens won. They won big, and they won absolutely everywhere. It didn't matter that the experts said that these barriers were too big, too high, too stout to ever come down. They got to work, right? They got off of Twitter. They turned off whatever partisan news bubble they were in, and they got to work trying to fix something. And so I was pretty sure we didn't need another book about how democracy dies. And I knew that I didn't want to go out and write that. There wasn't enough wine and ice cream in the world for me to be able to do that again. So what I really wanted to do was set out and to join these quiet revolutionaries who were trying to reinvigorate our civic fabric at the moment it seemed like we really needed it the most. And it was an inspiring year and a thrilling book to write. Maine, where they became at the time the first state to embrace ranked choice voting for just about all of their state and federal elections. It was a similar example as Alaska. Maine is a state that really prizes its history of independent politics. They want lots of choices, but the trouble was choice was being weaponized against them in many ways, because when you have 3 or 4 choices in a governor's race, it means that someone can win with 25, 26% of the vote. And that person might be the one who comes in last in a ranked choice election, right? The person gets elected even though 74% of the voters wanted somebody else. And so 9 of the previous 11 governors in Maine had been a plurality governor. And I believe it was 7 of those 9 had been elected with less than 40% of the vote. And so I think people were like, well, how do we keep what it is that we like about independent politics? All of these choices, the ability to kind of get ourselves out of the two-party red-blue dynamic and to be able to encourage independent voices, but also to put an end to spoilers and, talk of, well, if I vote strategic voting, if I vote for the person who I like the most, am I really helping to elect the person I like least? And so they embraced RCV as the way forward. And I think what they saw was that the public gets it, even though the politicians might like to say, oh, that's too confusing. And the city clerks might say, oh, we don't know how we'd administer that election. They can do it. They don't always want to do it. It's harder work maybe the first time, but it can be done. And when people are shown how it works, they grasp the idea of choice intuitively, because we all do it all the time. When we go out and order ice cream, if the flavor we want the most isn't there, we know what our second choice is. It's not that hard to do. When we're ordering pizza together as a group, this is what we're doing, right? We're using ranked choice. We're eliminating what everybody doesn't like, and we're trying to find a way to come to agreement on what the most people can accept. And so Maine has been extraordinarily effective with it. And I think one of the great examples, right, is the Susan Collins race for a U.S. Senate just last year. You had 2 independent candidates in that races, and the independents were welcomed. They were invited on stage in the debates. They weren't being pushed aside and called names and kept out, excluded. They were brought in. The conversation, the debate was better. Voters had more options. And in the end, the winner had 50% plus 1 of the vote, which is what an election ought to be.
All right, we got a couple of interesting questions here. One that I think everybody on this call is probably pretty wonky, and most of the people in the United States aren't. So, how do we get to that 2/3 or 80% or whatever it is that is pretty disinterested, except for maybe 30 days before an election? I'm always intrigued by the uncommitted or undecided voter 2 weeks before an election, when the incumbent's been in office for 4 years and they just can't quite figure it out.
Yeah, who are those people anyway?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a secondary question that I'd kind of like to throw multiple ones at you, if you don't mind. But somebody asked about public funding of elections, if that might help too. And honestly, I don't understand that. I know that comes up a lot in like the Unrigged Summit and stuff like that. So I guess number one, how do we get people involved? And number two, public funding of elections. How does that help the situation? Or what is your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that people understand these election reform issues better than we give them credit for. And I think that it's something that pulls people together. I mean, when Florida voted on felony reenfranchisement in 2018, and this went back to the state constitution in the days after the Civil War, when Florida would have been a majority black state after the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed. And so what Florida did, they had to ratify those amendments in order to get back in the Union, but they enacted black codes and felon disenfranchisement as a way to imprison folks for the smallest crime that you might commit if you were very poor, and then turn it into a felony that came with permanent loss of your voting rights. And those laws were still on the books heading into 2018. They had ensnared about, I think it was 1.4 million people in the state at the time. And so when a nonpartisan group worked to try to undo that, you have to get 60% of the vote on a ballot initiative in Florida to amend the Constitution. 2018, as you might remember, in Florida, super, super close year. Ron DeSantis becomes governor by a sliver. Like that night, that could have gone either way. Rick Scott wins the U.S. Senate seat by a sliver. But felon disenfranchisement, a question that wraps up race and voting and fairness and all of these things, not only won, it won with 64% of the vote. Redistricting wins in 2018 in Ohio, in Michigan, in Utah, in Missouri, and Colorado. Red states, blue states, purple states. It's close in Utah, 51-49. Every other state, it's 60, 70% of the vote. Voters get this inherently, and they are on the side of fairness and reform and honest elections. They really, really are. And I think that the beauty of these campaigns is that they can really find a way to pull people together toward a common goal of free and fair and representative elections at a time when not a lot of other things in our politics are doing that. I am not an expert on public financing, and I haven't studied it carefully, so I should probably pass on that one a little bit, except to say we've got way too much dark money floating around in our campaigns. We've got far too little transparency around who's giving what to whom and what they're getting for it. And the beauty of public financing and some of the experiments that are going around the country, like in Seattle, where they give everybody a democracy vouchers, and you're allowed to donate them to candidates of your choosing. Seems like a way to get more people involved. I'm all for trying as many reforms as we possibly can, seeing what works well, and going with it, right? I mean, states and cities ought to be laboratories of democracy. It feels like these days we've got too many meth labs of democracy as opposed to labs that are actually trying to solve problems and experiment in a good way. But when we can experiment and find solutions, I think we should.
And Josh, I'm paraphrasing. We've got a member named Josh Mueller, and he's asking a question like, if you could build a system, how would you build it? So we have 49 senators here in Nebraska. We have the unicameral system.
Oh, wow.
But if you could just like pick a perfect, well, there's no perfect system, but if you could come up with one that is somewhat bulletproof, what do you think you'd come up with?
I think a proportional system is really a good way to go. I just think it opens the door to more voices, and that people look at some of the extreme candidates that have gotten elected and say that's the problem. And I'm not so sure that is the problem. I'm not saying that Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene or whoever else shouldn't be able to have that seat if people want them in office and vote for them and choose them. The problem, I think, is that when every representative is incentivized to follow the lead of the most extreme, you end up with a system that is not catering towards the people, but towards the edges of these primaries. When people only care about the primary and not the general, you end up with a distorted view, and policy gets twisted in distorted ways. And I think that's what we've got to put an end to, and that's what a more proportional system would do. You would still have, you might still have a similar array of people, but the incentives before them would, I think, cause them to behave differently.
And this is more of a statement than a question, but here in Nebraska, you get away from the eastern part of the state and it's pretty much rural. Mm-hmm. And we've got 3 congressional representatives, and two of them are focused, one of them mainly in the Lincoln area, the other one in the Omaha area. And I guess if you did a proportional representation, those people would have to appeal to all the farmers, ranchers, et cetera, out there as well. And that makes it a little harder. And then in the primary system, you and I, in a phone call before this, talked a little bit about Ben Sass. And I've noticed that he here locally, you wouldn't notice it nationally, but he kind of stays quiet. And then when the primary is done, then he's bold again. And I think that had shut down a lot of that kind of activity. So does anyone else out there have any questions? I had a list here, and I've kind of gone through it. And I do really appreciate your giving us this much time. It's nice of you to do that. But if anyone else has a question, okay, Cindy has one.
Thank you very much, David. I didn't quite understand. Were you telling us that there's been redistricting reform that was actually passed ballot initiative?
Yes, ballot initiatives were passed in 2018 in Michigan, Colorado, Ohio, Missouri, Utah. I'm missing one of the states, or maybe not. And all of them were a little bit different, but right now you've got citizens in Michigan drawing lines. You've got a panel of Democrats, Republicans, and independents in Colorado working together on this project. You've got a commission in Virginia that was passed in 2019 and 2020 that is doing the process there. Ohio passed some new guardrails on their process, trying to make it a little less partisan. We'll see how well these do. Not every commission is perfect, and commissions are only as good as the criteria they're given and the people who serve on them. But the general rule has been that when you have commissions, or when you have more people in the room rather than just one party drawing lines, you end up with maps that end up better capturing the actual partisan breakdown of a state.
Here in Nebraska, there were 2 senators that tried to bring bills that would have made it impartial, and couldn't get it out of committee. So
politicians like to keep this process as close to them as they can.
Wes, we have someone whose hand is up.
I can you unmute him? I don't know if. There we go.
Hello, everyone. Joining you from the neighboring state of Illinois. I represent a new kind of technology that makes democracy possible in the United States and actually everywhere else around the world. We use it in our citizen assembly meetings, where we bring people together to actually deliberate and develop the best solutions to our common problems, to build support behind those ideas. And then the technology enables us to cross-reference which ideas the people support the most, to candidates who are willing to champion the will of the people, or else we replace them, because the platform enables us to create lists of ideal political candidates, thereby making politicians completely replaceable. So my question to you is, would you all like to join us in Citizen Assembly to participate in real citizen grassroots democracy?
I think that's something we'd have to educate ourselves on, and I hadn't heard of it, but I appreciate you sharing it. So maybe you can send us a note or something like that, and we can look into it.
Please do. In the chat, I just shared the link to the platform. There is an introductory video that's available to you. The journey starts right there. So
okay.
Thank you.
All right. I appreciate it. And Danielle, did you have a question?
I worked for years on the cannabis reform movement. I had a radio show during the 90s at KUCI FM in Irvine. And, they had like NORML, which was a pretty unified group on reforms. I wonder, is there like a similar kind of unified voice that the electoral reform movement can speak with or turn to, or is it kind of fragmented right now, or what's the best clearinghouse for all the different groups to keep them from working at cross purposes?
I think it's a diverse space, and it's a growing space as the threats to democracy and the need for this kind of reform have multiplied over recent years. But I don't think that there's many groups working at cross purposes. I do think that it's fairly united and collegial, despite the fact that it is spread out. And I think, as you can see, oftentimes by the groups that are supporting the For the People Act, HR 1, for example, that it's a really big, broad coalition of organizations that have come together on this, voting rights groups, civil rights groups, and the like, that have nonpartisan organizations, whether it's Common Cause, whether it's the League of Women Voters, or any number of the other groups that have worked on at the intersection of voting rights and civil rights over the years, whether that's the Lawyers Committee or the NAACP. So I think anytime, I'm sorry.
Oh, there's like the Pirate Party and Sociocracy, and there's lots of international reforms going on too that I would encourage people to
absolutely
coordinate with. Didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Nope. I was done. You got it.
All right. Well, Mr. Daley, you've given us a lot of your time, and I really do appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact, you and I were able to come into contact because I wrote an op-ed, and heck, you sent me an email, and all of a sudden it's like, cool, I'm talking to a guy that wrote a book that I'm seeing getting sold on national TV. And I really appreciate that. It's nice to network like that. And I hope we do some good things, and you're doing good things. And I just really appreciate the time you've given us, and I hope we get to talk again. We had some discussions about maybe having some contact in the future, and I hope we get to do that. And you writing any more books? Are you thinking about anything like that? Or
thinking about it.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
We'll see. I appreciate it, but what I really appreciate is the work all of you all are doing. It matters. It's making your state better. It's making the country better. It's the only way that we can come together in this perilous moment and find a way through. So I am grateful to all of you for what you are doing there, and happy to be of service any way I can be down the road. Thanks again.